Welcome and thank you for coming. I'm Professor von Robert and the Director of the Taube Center for Jewish Studies. And I am extremely happy to introduce you today to this year's Aaron-Roland visitor, Professor John Pawlikowski, who is Professor of Social Ethics at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, where he has taught since 1968. He is also the director of the Catholic Jewish Studies program there. So last academic year, I taught a course on Jews and Christians, conflict and coexistence, in which we examined, among a number of texts, the statement of the Catholic Church's revolutionary rethinking of its relationship to Jews and Judaism after centuries of a theological discourse that some have called a theological discourse of contempt that variously blamed Jews for the death of Jesus and for misinterpreting scripture and so on. That statement, which also included other religious faiths, known under the title of, or the name of Nostra Aetate, in part of the Second Vatican Council, was promulgated almost precisely half a century ago, on October 28th, 1965. So we thought that we should honor the Jubilee. And who could have been better than John Pawlikowski, one of the leading figures in Christian-Jewish dialogue in the United States and around the globe, who has published numerous books and articles in this area. And I'll name only a few book titles and numerous articles, but I only want to restrict myself a little bit. 3 book titles: Christ in the Light of the Christian-Jewish Dialogue, Jesus and the Theology of Israel, Reinterpreting Revelation and Tradition, Jews and Christians in Conversation. The institutional expression of his commitment, is that he was a 2-term president and chair of the Theology Committee of the International Council of Christians and Jews. He remains on the board as immediate past president. John Pawlikowski also serves on numerous advisory boards and councils, and I'm going to name but a few so you get an idea of what organizations exist that promote dialogue and peaceful coexistence. He's on the board of directors of the Parliament of the World's Religions, on the National Advisory Council of the United States Committee for the World Conference of Religions for Peace. He's on the board of directors of the annual Scholars Conference on the Holocaust, Genocide, and the Church Struggle, the National Advisory Council of Facing History and Ourselves, and the World Committee of the National Association of Diocesan Ecumenical Officers of the Interreligious Coordinating Council in Israel. He also was a board member of the now defunct National Conference of Catholic Bishops Advisory Committee on Catholic-Jewish Relations. And additionally, he was a member of the Vatican delegation for the International Jewish Catholic Dialogues in Baltimore in 1992, in Jerusalem in 1994, and in New York in 2001. So this list could go on and on. John Pawlikowski also did extensive study of the Nazi Holocaust and has produced numerous publications about ethical challenges facing the human community emerging from a catastrophic 20th century, at least the first half, and again published a number of books in this area, to name but 3. The Challenge of the Holocaust for Christian Theology, Good and Evil After Auschwitz, and Ethics in the Shadow of the Holocaust. In 1980, he was appointed to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council by the then President Jimmy Carter, and subsequently reappointed by Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. All this is but a short excerpt of his illustrious career and the commitments and publications and teaching that he has been engaged in. And I could continue, and for instance, more recently, he also served as the principal theological consultant for the U.S. Catholic Bishop Statement on Energy, and on and on and on. I'm just so glad that you agreed to come out to the West Coast, even though the weather is balmy in Chicago right now. And we are keeping him busy here. He went to my alma mater, the Center for Jewish Studies at the Great Theological Union in Berkeley earlier today. So please help me to give him a warm welcome to Stanford.
Well, good evening, and thank you for coming. It certainly is delightful to be here. It's actually my first professional responsibility at Stanford. I did have the opportunity to visit the campus just as a tourist some years ago. I have to begin, as is the custom these days, with full disclosure. In Labor Day weekend, I attended the Northwestern Stanford game. I have to confess, I did not cheer for Stanford. Anyway, yes, more seriously, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of this remarkable document, actually, Nostra Aetate, in our time. A document which is one of the shortest documents coming from the Second Vatican Council, but one that perhaps revolutionized the kind of Catholic perspectives in a way that almost no other document has. It completely changed the template, if I can use that term, of the Catholic Church regarding non-Christian religions, including Judaism. A word or two about the history of the document. I don't know how many of you might have some familiarity with that history, but let me go through it somewhat quickly. When the council was convened and the original agenda was set out before the council actually opened, there was nothing on the agenda dealing with the Catholic Church's attitude towards Jews and Judaism or any other world religion. Some people, however, became very interested in having Pope John the 23rd meet with the French Jewish historian Jules Isaac. Jules Isaac had already written several books on the issue of historic Christian anti-Semitism, and he was anxious to share his reflections with the Pope. That meeting was set up, and Isaac at the end said, after the conversation that they had, said to the Pope something like, well, might I expect anything from the council on this subject? And I guess John the 23rd's initial response was, well, wait and see. Within a few days after that meeting, John the 23rd contacted Cardinal Augustin Bea and told him to begin work on a document on the church and the Jewish people. I'll get back to it in a moment, but let me just say the eventual document Nostra Aetate does not formally speak of the Shoah or the Holocaust. However, I think it would, in some ways, it would not have happened if this awful period had not transpired. Because both Jules Isaac, who lost most of his family in the Shoah, and also John the 23rd were impacted by the Holocaust. John the 23rd was papal nuncio to Istanbul during that period, and is one of the several nuncios that who have been honored for their effort to save Jews by issuing false baptismal certificates during this period. So he had already demonstrated some profound sensitivity for the situation of Jews, especially during the Shoah and so on. Well, then Cardinal Bea began to appoint a commission to begin to work on such a document. It was slow going at first. In fact, there was nothing at the first session of the Second Vatican Council on the subject of the church and the Jewish people. That only began to come to the agenda of the council in its second session. And it became quite controversial. There were opponents, both opponents who objected to it theologically, and to some extent opponents who objected to it politically. The theological objectors, some of them, of course, were associated with the founder of the St. Pius X Society, because one of the St. Pius X Society was the group that eventually was excommunicated by Pope Paul VI for refusing to accept a number of the documents of Vatican II, but in particular the documents on religious liberty and the document on interreligious relations. And to this day, they still maintain staunch opposition to those two documents. Now, they are the people associated with then Cardinal Marcel Lefebvre. Now, when the council began to consider the document, it was not clear where the document fitted in the council scheme. Many of the people who were initially supporting the idea of a document on the church and the Jewish people actually were urging that it become part of the major theological document from the council on ecclesiology, or on the nature of the church, which eventually came to be known as Lumen Gentium. And in fact, Lumen Gentium has a little bit on this subject, which is certainly in basic conformity with what is said in a more detailed way in chapter 4 of Nostra Aetate. Now the question comes up, why did the John the 23rd, why did the Vatican Council actually even take up this issue? I think there are a number of causal factors that played a role in generating support for Nostra Aetate. Because even though Nostra Aetate was considerably controversial in the course of the council, and frankly almost went down the tubes a number of times, as did the document on religious liberty, which is kind of a companion document to Nostra Aetate, nonetheless, in the end, it was an overwhelmingly positive vote for the document, with I think something like 80 or 85 people voting no out of 2,000 more. So I mean, it was an overwhelming approval. A lot of that is due, frankly, to the skill of Cardinal Augustin Bea, who was able to, if I say, manipulate the system to make sure that this document continued on the conciliar agenda, especially with the transition of popes. As you know, John the 23rd died in the middle of the council, and Paul VI took over, and so on. Now, Paul VI certainly deserves credit for giving final approval to the document, even though he's not so well known in terms of the relationship with this document as is John the 23rd. I mean, John the 23rd put it on the agenda of the council, and that was an important step. As I say, there are a number of causal factors that brought about, I think, the issuance of Nostra Aetate. First of all, people in the Christian community had been exposed to the ugliness and the effect of historic Christian anti-Semitism during the Holocaust. I think finally it took something like that to convince a significant group of people that this kind of teaching about Jews and Judaism that had prevailed over the centuries was poison, and it was a cancer in Christianity that had to be removed. And they were determined to do that. Some of them had actually been involved in Catholic resistance movements in places like France and Holland and so on. So they already were people who had opposed what the Nazis were doing to Jews and so on during the war. So that was one group of people. There was a group of, within the field of biblical scholarship, there was the early beginnings of what became really almost a kind of a sea change in the way that Catholic and Christian biblical scholars approached the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and how they regarded the validity and use of Jewish sources and Jewish interpretations in their own work. Basically, the prevailing view for a long time was, look, Jews have nothing to tell Christians even about the New Testament, but even about the Old Testament. They don't understand it properly, and you can only understand it properly by the lens of Christianity. And so they disregarded Jewish scholarship and didn't really bring it into play. One example of that, Monsignor John Osterreicher, who was one of the pioneers in promoting the document and had played a major role in the document. If you want to read more about his efforts and his Protestant compatriot, Karl Thieme, I would suggest you look at Professor John Conley's book from Berkeley, From Enemy to Brother, which really records that history in a very enlightening way. But even Osterreicher, who began publishing a yearly kind of annual on Christian-Jewish relations, Catholic-Jewish relations to be specific, called Bridges. Bridges or Bridge, I forget which. In the first 4 volumes, which came out before the council, no Jewish contributor was allowed to publish in it. It was only the last volume, number 5, which came out after the council, that you began to get Jewish contributors. And so even that illustrates some of the change that was beginning to occur. So that was a factor. There was beginning to be a group of biblical scholars who really felt that Christian interpretation, both theological and biblical, had to kind of change its attitudes with regard to Jews and Judaism. There were also a series of textbook studies that were done here in the United States and also similarly in certain parts of Europe and Canada. Here in the United States, this textbook project was sponsored by the Ford Foundation, began roughly around 1958, continued through about 1962, and it involved Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, each looking at their basic educational materials to see how they treated some 9 religious and racial outgroups. And the Catholic studies were done at St. Louis University, the Jesuit university in St. Louis, and particularly the religion studies were just being completed as the council was opening. And Rabbi Mark Tenenbaum of the American Jewish Committee, which coordinated this project, brought the initial results of the religion analysis to the Second Vatican Council. And this, while sometimes the influence of these studies are exaggerated, I've heard people say, Cardinal Bea actually read the results. There's no evidence that he actually did. But they were influential with the American bishops. I mean, they were shown to the American bishops and so on. The American bishops were absolutely critical in the passage of Nostra Aetate and also Dignitatis Humanae, the document on religious liberty. I would dare say that without their strong and I think virtually unanimous support of these documents, they may not have seen the light of day. They may have gone down the tubes. The late Monsignor George Higgins, who was a very influential behind-the-scenes person at Vatican II, says that Nostra Aetate and Dignitatis Humanae represent the most important and distinctive contribution of the American bishops to the Second Vatican Council. Part of the reason for that, when you ask the question, why were the American bishops so strongly behind these 2 documents? They were not especially a progressive lot. They were kind of a moderate group of bishops. They were not sort of on the same level as some of the great Episcopal leaders of the Council from Europe. But I think what they had was a kind of collective memory of a very positive relationship with Protestants and Jews in the 1930s and 1940s, What happened during that period was Monsignor John A. Ryan, who was the first secretary of what became known originally as the National Catholic Welfare Conference, eventually became the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, organized a coalition of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews to support the New Deal legislation. And they went on national radio and so on, and they were, secular historians credit them with a tremendous influence on the passage of the New Deal legislation. Franklin Roosevelt certainly was very grateful, especially to Ryan. Ryan was the only person ever asked to give the invocation at 2 of FDR's inaugurations. This created, I think, a positive rapport among Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish religious leaders. Now, it didn't change everything. Reformation Sunday was still Reformation Sunday. Good Friday was still Good Friday. But it did create a sense among many of the American bishops, not necessarily those who were at the council, but it created this collective memory that indeed by interfaith cooperation, collaboration, you can achieve some good results, which are good also for your own church. So I think Catholics were greatly benefited from the New Deal legislation. So this kind of activist collaboration, I think, left a positive outlook on Catholic participation in interreligious activities. Now, look, it wasn't 100%. I remember being in primary school when the second post-war session of the World Council of Churches took place in Evanston, Chicago, Northwestern University, and so on. And the closing ceremony took place at Soldier Field in Chicago, and they expected 100 to 125,000 people. Well, the week after that event, the Catholic Church sponsored a Marian Congress at Soldier Field. And as students in the primary school, we were strongly urged to get everyone we could, our grandmothers, great-grandmothers, grandfathers, whoever, down to Soldier Field so that the Catholics could say that, in fact, they had more people at their event than the World Council of Churches had at their event. Actually, it proved to be true. We had about 250,000 or something. But I just want to illustrate that this interfaith collaboration didn't eliminate a lot of the previous attitudes, but I think it began to generate a new spirit, and that spirit, I think, was manifested in this very strong support for these two documents on the part of the American bishops. So those were some of the, I think, the causal influences, but again, I want to underscore how important Cardinal Augustin Bea was. And Bea himself has an interesting history, because in the 1920s and 30s, there began to arise in parts of Europe, particularly in Germany, sort of Catholic-Jewish friendship groups. And they were positive. They were kind of prototypes of later dialogue groups. But the Vatican was very uneasy about them, thinking that it was leading to relativism and so on. And so Cardinal Bea was actually sent to investigate these groups. Well, they did a number on him and persuaded him to let go of his criticisms and join them, and he did. Now, Bea, interestingly enough, came from a relatively small village in Germany, but his father had a number of Jewish professor friends, not just on the academic level, but even on the social level. And apparently, so Cardinal Bea, growing up, had contact with living Jews, in a context of where his father and the Jewish colleagues were quite friendly and positive towards each other. So the history of Bea on this question is an interesting one. Now, what did Nostra Aetate say in chapter 4? Now, let me just say the Nostra Aetate has 4 chapters. The first chapter is a more generic chapter, but it does contain one very important sentence, and that is that the Catholic Church does not reject anything good or valuable in other religious traditions. Now, that may sound rather limited and hardly sensational by today's standards, but when you look, for example, to go back to these textbook studies that were done at St. Louis University, when you look at what was said in those textbooks, by and large, people, especially non-Christians, were basically portrayed as enemies of the Catholic Church, as people who are trying to subvert the Catholic Church, and so on. So even this statement now that the Church recognizes holy, positive elements in other religious traditions was, in a sense, a giant leap to a new template on this subject. It didn't solve all the problems, but nonetheless, it really turned, I think, in a very profound way, the fundamental attitude of the Catholic Church towards non-Christians. The subsequent 2 chapters then go into especially relationships with Islam, but also secondarily relationships with Buddhism, Hinduism, and some of the other religions. The question of Islam in Nostra Aetate has been discussed at times. There has been a tendency on the part of some people to say, well, that was only included because, for political reasons, because the bishops from the Middle East did not want to go home with an exclusively Catholic document. They felt that that would be detrimental to the life of the church in the kind of small Christian communities in many of those countries. I think there's some validity to that. There were people, I think, who expressed that concern to the Pope and so on. But I think there's a more positive reason why Islam was included, and that is that some of the missionary bishops had really come to know Muslims in Africa and Asia and so on, and had acquired not just a kind of blind affection for Islam, but nonetheless had seen very positive elements and so on, and wanted a more positive assessment put into Nostra Aetate than perhaps was the prevailing view. And so, I mean, I think that really accounts in part for the what is said in about Islam, which is the only other religion that gets sort of specific mention. I mean, Hindus and Buddhists are mentioned, but barely. They don't. Whereas Islam, there is some detailing of what Muslims believe and how some of that can be very positively viewed by Catholic Christians. Chapter 4 of Nostra Aetate, which is the most developed part of the document, indeed kind of revolved around 3 basic assertions. The first assertion, and this is crucial, is that Jews were not collectively responsible for the death of Christ. And that removal, now, the newspaper headlines right after the vote on Nostra Aetate, as usual, got it only half right. Many of the newspapers, had headlines, Catholics exonerate Jews. Well, that was not the case. That was not what the Vatican Council said. What they said is there wasn't anything to exonerate because there was never guilt in the first place. And so, but that claim that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ and therefore were expelled from a covenantal relationship with God and replaced there by the church and so on, was indeed at the heart of a great deal of Christian theology and was certainly at the heart of the way that Christianity, including Catholicism, had understood its relationship with the Jewish people over the centuries. So that the removal of that charge against the Jewish, even though the word deicide was not used in the end to the criticism of some in the Jewish community, nonetheless was absolutely crucial in changing the template regarding Jews and Judaism. The second assertion was that in light of the fact that Jews cannot be held responsible collectively for the death of Christ, the second affirmation said, therefore, they remain in the covenant even after the Christ event. They were not removed from the covenant. They were not, sent out as people, as perpetual wanderers with no homeland of their own, and so on. Now, it is true that under this kind of viewpoint, it's important to understand that the church never really wished for or proclaimed the need to totally obliterate the Jewish people. And a lot of this is dependent on St. Augustine. St. Augustine developed this notion of witness people. The Jews were witnesses to what happens to you when you don't accept Christ. And what happens to you is that you are perpetual wanderers, you are doomed to a life of misery, suffering, and so on. And Jews were to serve as a warning to other people. Again, what happens if you don't accept Christ? This is going to be your situation as well. So, but in that sense, Augustine wanted to keep the Jews alive and not simply to obliterate them. Otherwise, this witness dimension would have vanished. The third assertion was that Jesus had a positive, not a negative approach to Jews and Judaism, that he drew substantially on parts of the Jewish tradition of the time. Now, important to remember that the Jewish community at the time was a very multifaceted community, had many different groups. There wasn't one Judaism, there were many Judaisms. And Jesus couldn't possibly have drawn on all of them because they were in many cases in contradiction to one another. But many scholars feel, this is, getting into a lot of controversial academic material, that he basically drew from what we call, for want of a better term, the Pharisaic tradition. In fact, the 1985 Vatican note celebrating the 20th anniversary of Nostra Aetate actually says that Jesus stood closer to the Pharisees than to any other Jewish group at the time. You may ask me, well, why are the Pharisees, why do they get such bad press? I can go into that, but I think it's a complicated issue. Part of it may be simply that the denunciation of the Pharisees was a limited denunciation of some Pharisaic groups. There were multiple Pharisaic groups. They were not necessarily, the Jewish scholar, late Jewish scholar David Flusser identified some 7 groups of Pharisees. This doesn't mean that there were 7 offices of various Pharisaic groups somewhere in Jerusalem. These were trends, as we would say to this. They were trending in 7 different directions. They were the more perhaps progressive parts of the Jewish community at the time, and so on. So I think that you can make the argument that Jesus did pick up some from this so-called Pharisaic tradition. Even the name for this group is sometimes discussed at length and not so clear, and so on. Sometimes I compare it to, I often use the analogy of primary campaigns in this country, Democrats and Republicans. We certainly have an example of that in recent weeks. The 15 or so candidates on the Republican Party, they're all supposed to be the members of the same party, but they don't always speak well of each other in their public debates. So, you can sometimes have more bitter struggles with people you are closer to than people who are, miles away from you intellectually, politically, and so on. You really don't care about them because you really have nothing in common. So I would say some of that was happening with respect to the the attacks, so-called attack on the Pharisees that one finds in parts of the New Testament. Okay, now what has happened since Nostra Aetate? Well, a lot has happened, frankly. Maybe the most profound thing is that there has been a real bonding created on a personal level, on an institutional level, between Jews and Christians, not 100%, but certainly among many Jews and Christians. It has survived a number of challenges that could have brought down the relationship, whether it was the Pope visiting with Waldheim, whether it was the Mel Gibson film, whatever, and so on. But it has survived all this, and I think the leadership on both levels, while they've had some tough moments, have really said to each other, we don't want to break this down completely. We want to work this out. And most of the crises that have developed have, in fact, been worked out. That we really need to maintain this relationship. Now, in terms of issues, I would say, there has been one of the most remarkable developments. I won't say it's due exclusively to Nostra Aetate, has been the transformation in biblical scholarship, both in terms of the New Testament and also in terms of the approach to the Hebrew Scriptures or Old Testament. And even from the Jewish side, we have books like Amy Jill Levine's various books on Jesus, the Misunderstood Jew, but especially the Jewish annotated New Testament, which Charlotte has contributed to, and so on. And this are Jewish commentaries on the various books of the New Testament. So there's been a lot of fertile interaction between Jewish and Christian biblical scholarship. The whole attitude towards St. Paul has profoundly been altered. For I would say many years, almost for centuries, St. Paul was viewed as the person who kind of produced the definitive break between Christianity and Judaism. One of the things we now know that, first of all, from something that is on occasion called the parting of the ways scholarship, that the separation between Jews and Christians was a far longer process than we may have imagined. I think many of us, both on the Jewish side and the Christian side, grew up imagining by the time Jesus died, there were two separate religious communities, Christianity and Judaism. Scholars like John Meyer at Notre Dame, Christian scholars and others, have argued this ain't true, that in fact, John Meyer has argued that Jesus never intended to establish a totally new religious community apart from Judaism, but rather a new kind of distinctive group within the Jewish family at the time. That may or may not be the case, but clearly there is a new attitude about that, and the feeling is that, in fact, the more permanent break between Judaism and Christianity did not occur until the 2nd, 3rd centuries, and even in a few places somewhat later. Amy Jill Levine, for example, has told me she's found some evidence of continued kind of association and collaboration as late as the 5th century of the Common Era. So that's a whole new outlook on the relationship. What the implications of that has perhaps not been completely probed. I think it has significant implications for Christian theology. Christians have been very fond of saying that Christ founded the church, but what does that mean when you know that there was no separate institution at the time of Jesus, nor for a number of decades beyond that? So when you say, as we sort of celebrate on Holy Thursday, the founding of the church by Jesus, historically now that has some real questions about it. And okay, history is not the absolute determinant of faith perspectives, but it can't be ignored either, in my judgment. Now, Unfortunately, a lot of the scholarship has still not permeated what I call Christian theology. Now, right after the issuance of Nostra Aetate, there was a fair amount of writing by various Christians on how one can proclaim the continued validity of Jews in a covenantal relationship with God while still maintaining the universal significance of Christ for all humanity. Some of that theology is now sort of waned. It's not as, there are still people writing on that, including myself, but it's not as central as it was for the first decade after Vatican II. And I think we still have a lot of work to do in that area. On the Jewish side, of course, it would really be a false picture to say that a lot of Jewish scholars are rushing to talk about the Jewishness of Jesus or about theological issues. As someone said right now, Christian scholars may worry a lot and about the Christian-Jewish relationship theologically. Jews tend to worry more about the Iranian nuclear agreement. So there's a little bit of a difference in our two communities' approach to this. But there are some Jewish scholars who have begun to take an interest in the question of how you relate Christian-Jewish relations theologically. And I mentioned people like Elliot Wolfson, and so on, and Daniel Boyarin at Berkeley, and so on. Now, you know, these people are not transforming the Jewish world of scholarship all that much, but they're beginning to raise some interesting questions. There's a relatively new book that came out fairly recently by a gentleman named Saul Magid, on Hasidism, and in which he talks about Hasidism as incarnationalism. Now that's very controversial, and some scholars have just kind of rejected his view out of hand. Even in a more kind of overall perspective, someone like Moshe Idel, the great scholar, rejects the whole notion of incarnation, just feels that no Jewish scholar should talk about it because it causes confusion. The interesting thing about Magid's thesis, as far as I see it, is not that he's claiming the Hasidic movement had a kind of incarnationalism, because the Hasidic movement obviously is much, much after the early period. But his claim is, rightly or wrongly, that what the Hasidism was doing was picking up on a theme which had been buried in Jewish scholarship after the break with Christianity and after Christianity acquired political power, for fear of blurring Jewish identity in a time when protection of Jewish identity became a really major task for the Jewish community, when they didn't have power, they didn't have control of the culture, and so on. And so he's saying that actually Hasidism picked up on this theme and brought it back to the surface. That may or may not be eventually accepted by many other scholars, or maybe rejected, I don't know. But at least it's an interesting development, which is beginning to at least question. I mean, so often Christology is presented as the absolute wall of separation between Judaism and Christianity. And there's just a little bit, I won't say there's even a hole in the wall, but there's a little rattling of the wall, I think, with this kind of scholarship. But we're facing other challenges. The interreligious movement, I think, as a whole is gaining new strength, but the interreligious movement is really arguing for inclusion of all religious traditions in the dialogue, and not so much valuing the specific dialogues, say, between Catholics and Jews, Muslims and Jews, even between various groups of Christians and so on. And for me, I don't believe it's an either or. I strongly support the move towards wider interreligious relations, but I do think there's an important role for these more specific dialogues, because there are issues you can't, issues between such communities which you can't necessarily discuss in great depth in a wider interreligious context. But we also, I think, those who have been interested in the Christian-Jewish relationship often take a rather negative view, of a hostile view towards this movement towards a wider interreligious pluralism. I think rather than taking a negative view, we really have to look for ways that we can bring the fruits of the, say, the Catholic-Jewish dialogue, the Christian-Jewish dialogue, to the wider interreligious movement. I think the nature of religion is also changing. I mean, young people are not so enamored anymore with institutional religion. Doesn't mean they want to totally separate themselves from the tradition, but they're not so, and a lot of Catholic-Jewish relations has been done as kind of the upper level. That has a value. I don't want to completely demean it, but I think we need to find ways, because so much of what, the beautiful statements are made and so on, but they have no impact. There's no implementation. And I think more and more the implementation of the vision of Nostra Aetate has to take place in personal encounters, in university settings, and in other grassroots settings and so on. I think that's extremely important. So that's another, I think, challenge that we face in terms of not only Catholic-Jewish relations, but interreligious relations generally. So in conclusion, I think I can say it's been a bumpy road, but a very productive road. And I think, as, say, my colleague, Rabbi David Rosen, has said, when you look at it, in 50 years, virtually a 2,000-year history of fratricide has been reversed. And that should give us some hope that in other situations where there's been tremendous enmity and hatred and so on, that such reversal can also take place. I think the reversal is permanent. I don't think there's going to be backsliding. I believe there are going to be further challenges, as we've had challenges over the last 50 years, but hopefully we have the commitment, the will to work through these, and I'm certainly remain committed to that task, and hopefully you will as well. So thank you again for coming, and if we have time, I'm certainly open to questions and so on.
I'm a Jewish chaplain over at the hospital and wanted to share a story that was related to me by Father Frank Norris, who is a theologian in this area, attended and taught at the seminary in Menlo Park, and worked in this document in the 60s with the Vatican as a theologian. And it's a story about to underscore what you said about the power of the friendliness in the 20s and 30s. And for me, it's a story about the power of kindness. I was his chaplain. This was during my training in 1999 on the unit at the hospital. I got to know him just before he died. And he called me in one day, wanted to tell me this story, and asked me to sit down. He said in the 1930s, he was a small boy, growing up in Marin, which is the county nearby, just north of San Francisco. And they were a poor family and didn't have much money in those early 30s. And there was a family next door who would provide them with ham, made sure at Christmas they had a ham and a Christmas tree every year. And then he went on, and through tears, he began to tell me in the mid-1930s he went to the newsreels and he saw pictures of an elderly or a Jewish couple forced to wear their yellow stars while the youth were hassling them and the Nazis were laughing. And then he began to sob, and he said, and if that was in this country, that would have been my neighbors, Abe and Rose.
Well, there was a human. I mean, look, I grew up, people sometimes ask me how I got involved in Christian-Jewish relations, and my response sometimes is through the stomach. Because I grew up in the shadow of a very large Orthodox synagogue where most of the people came from either Poland or then Czechoslovakia. And virtually all the shops around us were Jewish-owned, Jewish deli, bakery, so on. Jewish bakery did its best business on Sunday mornings after Mass. People literally stood outside. But more interesting, two little episodes from that experience. One was there was a little mom and pop sort of grocery store, had a soda fountain. And the kids from the neighborhood used to gather there after school to buy a Coke or an ice cream or something. And there was a young Jewish lad who became somewhat friendly with me inside the store. We never exchanged names, but we always greeted each other, and we were about the same age. But I was always confused because as soon as we stepped outside, it was like he didn't know me. And I think he was afraid of being seen sort of fraternizing with the goy. My grandmother, and let me preface this by saying, my grandmother used to always tell us that it always rained rather heavily in September. And why was that the case? Because that was the month normally of the Jewish holidays, and God was crying over the Jews. But my grandmother went on, we had a parkway 1 block from our house, and right in front of the synagogue, and my grandmother would go out there on a nice summer day and sit with the Jewish ladies from Poland and Czechoslovakia and, engage in kind of the most normal human conduct conversation. And this theology of God crying of the Jews never really entered the picture. However, I do say that in times of social crisis, that could have suddenly erupted. And therefore it's important to eradicate it, because we have many examples from personal bios of Jews who survived, say, in Germany in particular, where they had for years this wonderful relationship with neighbors and social relations, and like in a period of 2 weeks, that was all broken. And again, it was like these people never knew them. So I think while these social relations are very important, there's something more is also needed. But one of the areas where there is a new emphasis on interreligious relations is indeed hospital chaplaincies, because frequently a hospital chaplain has to go into the room of someone who's of another religious tradition and certainly needs to know something about how to approach that person.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
When I visited Catholic patients, they'll call me Father Feldstein.
Yeah, you talked about grassroots interactions, and I wonder what you would have to say about the natural overlap of Orthodox Jewish interests and church interests with respect to public support of parochial schools, with respect to birth issues, with respect to sexuality issues, where there is a commonality of interest.
Well, it's an interesting question you raise. There have been parallel Catholic-Jewish dialogue, more or less along the lines you just articulated. Cardinal O'Connor, when he was in New York, created an Orthodox Jewish Catholic dialogue, apart from the already long-established Catholic dialogue with something called the National Council of Synagogues, which embraces the Reformed, Conservative, and Reconstruction branches, but not the Orthodox branch. And the agenda for the Catholic Orthodox Jewish dialogue was very much these hot-button issues, you're right. That generally was not the same topics that were taken up by the other dialogue. So yeah, we have... Well, I mean, to some extent, the reality is that sometimes you you feel closer to someone in another tradition than you do to certain people in your own tradition. I mean, a friend of mine from Canada, who's been very much involved in Christian-Jewish dialogue over the years, was asked to come to a Christian, basically not, he was the only Catholic there, a Christian Jewish conversation about support for the Tea Party. So, I mean, there are many shades of Christian-Jewish dialogue.
What is the position of the Church about the establishment of the State of Israel, with Jerusalem its capital, and the ingathering of a large portion of the Jewish people in Israel?
Well, it took a lot of time, but gradually over years, of course, we reached the position of the so-called Fundamental Accord signed by Israel and the Holy See, which certainly recognized the State of Israel with all its diplomatic formality. There's an official Israeli ambassador to the Vatican, there's an official Vatican ambassador to Israel, and so on. The Catholic Church institutionally has never endorsed the notion of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. It doesn't deny the right of Israel to be present in Jerusalem and have a say, but the position of the Vatican has largely been that Jerusalem remains a topic of some negotiation, hopefully at some point, between representatives of Israel and the Palestinian Authority.
Is there a difference between the political position and the theological position?
Is there a difference? Yeah. I would say not really. I think most people in the Vatican, there are maybe some who still believe that one day the Crusader flag will fly over Jerusalem, but they are beginning to be few and far between. I think the Vatican, in its more political dimensions, has certainly embraced the idea that there will be a strong Jewish presence, that somehow Israel will control at least important parts of Jerusalem, but what you do with the Palestinian presence, I think, remains an open question to be negotiated by the Israelis and the Palestinians, and not dictated by the Vatican or anyone else. I think the Vatican has more or less moved away from its earlier support for Jerusalem as an international city. I think they do want they would like to see some formal guarantees, documents that would protect the presence of Christian institutions in the Holy Land, but that would be guarantees not only from the Israelis but also from the Palestinians. But the idea, which they did embrace for a number of decades, of a more international status for the city, I think has been sort of quietly put aside, in part on the grounds that it's just not a workable idea. Because ultimately you have to decide in an international city who collects the garbage, for example.
I was just wondering what you thought of the various Judeo-Christian study centers of your own in different universities and places across the U.S. and how have they contributed? I remember reading about Rose Theron, a Jamaican who was also behind the scenes
she basically did the religion study for this project.
She started at Seton, but I know they're all over, and I don't know.
We just had a meeting last week. We had the annual meeting of the Council of Centers this past weekend at Boston College. There are now approximately 34, 35 of these. Some of them have have arisen and have died for various reasons. Almost all of them are in educational institutions, a few freestanding ones like Baltimore, but they're either in theological schools or universities. I think these are the hope of the future. I think this is where, if implementation of Nostra Aetate is to take place, this is one of the major places that must happen. So I'm very positive. I helped found that coalition. Now, has it done everything it might? No, but I think it has good potential. If any institution, or if you want to say institutional implementation is to take place, I think it's more likely to take place in that context than, through bishops or cardinals or the Vatican itself.
When Pope Francis was here, some of his biographers reported that Nostra Aetate had a formative influence on him. And I wonder if you have any sense of why it was his being here during the anniversary of this. He didn't choose to comment on Nostra Aetate. Do you think that Nostra Aetate has a future which others like Francis, if they chose?
I think he didn't comment. I can't say for sure how the thing was conceived. There was some concern on the part of the Jewish community actually about the U.S. government's reception, which took place on the eve of Yom Kippur, the night of Yom Kippur, beginning of Yom Kippur. Therefore, many Jews were not able to attend that. Most Jews were not able to attend that. He did, though, however, speak twice. Back at the end of June, there was a celebration of Chapter 4 of Nostra Aetate in Rome. I was present for that. And he had a private audience with about 200 of the delegates, greeted each one of us personally, and made a strong statement supporting Nostra Aetate. More recently, just last week, there was another conference celebrating Nostra Aetate in Rome, kind of the larger document, not just focused on Chapter 4, but on the whole document. And again, he made some statements. So, but while he was here in the United States, he did make a very important gesture. Some of you may be aware with the sort of historic image of the church-synagogue relationship portrayed in, for example, on the facade of the cathedral in Strasbourg, where the church has been portrayed as a vivacious young woman, bright-eyed, holding a book of the Gospels, and Judaism portrayed as a bent-over, blindfolded old woman holding a broken Torah. And that was a clear message, especially to people who were in many cases illiterate and did not read documents but could look at images. While he was here, actually, the Friday, while he was in Philadelphia, although he did not attend this, there was the dedication of a new sculpture, kind of off this theme, but portraying the two women now is sitting next to each other in discussion, both very dignified, and that kind of epitomizes, I think, the change in the perception of the Christian-Jewish relationship. And you may recall that on Sunday, probably due to Rabbi Skorka, his great friend from Buenos Aires, who actually had a private meeting with him Sunday morning, he went to St. Joseph's University. It was not originally on his itinerary. He went to St. Joseph's University to bless this sculpture and so on. So that was his one gesture. And this Pope, I think, is going to be far more a Pope of gesture than a Pope of text. That's his nature.
There's been quite a bit of reporting about that relationship.
Sure, they wrote the book together.
Yeah, is there any precedent for that with prior popes? Is that a first? What does that signal as far as?
I don't think that any prior pope had such a close relationship with an individual leader in the Jewish community. No.
It's kind of interesting, the different dimensions of it. It's
Yeah,
obviously academic, but it's
Peter
obviously
probably
universal.
did, but after Peter,
Post-Peter.
post-Peter, it's, no, this is, I mean, certainly, I mean, John Paul II had a very close relationship with this gentleman named Jerzy Kluger, who was, they grew up together in the small town in Poland. Hadn't seen him for years, and then saw him after he became Pope. So he had that close relationship. I don't think that Benedict had any particular close Jewish friend.
All religions have their mythologies that have contributed to the development of different cultures, including Jews, Catholics, Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, etc. And we have developed traditions that we all adhere to. Well, let's say, individually, these groups adhere to various traditions which give us a great deal of comfort. But I think if you look at it, most of these things keep us also prisoners because of magical thinking.
Well, let's see. I'm not going to get into the magic side. I'll leave that to some others. But I mean, I think we look. I do think there are. I think every religious tradition needs to have some basic beliefs that they hold, that they adhere to fairly strongly. Perhaps need to have some boundaries. On the other hand, you're right, sometimes we can so insulate ourselves that we don't appreciate other religious traditions, or we really begin to portray them in a very negative light, as the textbooks I mentioned had done, you know, they're basically as enemies of my religious tradition. So somewhere in between, we have to find a way. As someone once said, there is no interfaith if there isn't faith. So if people come to interreligious relations with very little commitment to any kind of tradition, maybe a kind of really nebulous, well, I'm spiritual, but I don't really have any great set of beliefs, explicit beliefs, I think that's not a good building base for authentic interreligious relations. But we also have to be prepared to change and to recognize that some of our views may be far too limited, that there may be similar views in other religions, but there may also be dissimilar. I mean, sometimes in interreligious relations, the stress is on finding similarities, as though diversity was bad. I think in part diversity is good. I think that we also, I mean, one of the issues we have to continue to deal with, certainly in Catholic-Jewish relations, Christian-Jewish relations, but in other interreligious relations at all, is the issue of proselytizing and evangelization. My colleague, David Sandmel, has said, when all is said and done, proselytizing can be a kind of soft form of genocide, because the end result, if it were successful, would be the same, the elimination of the Jews or some other religious group. And I have to ask myself, and I have to ask my brothers and sisters in the Christian community, do we think that God wants the elimination of people of all the other faith traditions? My answer is no.
I think the big difference between Catholics and Jews is, and now I'm totally getting in trouble, but Jews are perennial pessimists and Catholics are perennial optimists.
Oh no, believe me, I know lots of Catholic pessimists.
No, that's probably not
Yeah.
true. But the question I have, and I asked you this before, is that it seems to me that the liberal, in the past 50 years, it was sort of the liberal center that was the carrier of the willingness and the enthusiasm and interest in interreligious dialogue. But it's the liberal churches and arguing on the Jewish side also is the liberal seminaries that are actually struggling. I mean, the GTU across the bay, where you were today, they also have a hard time financially, but it's in the end not just right. It's not just a financial issue. Of course, it's that's one expression of it. So I'm just wondering what the future of this is if we lose sort of the. I mean, no one can predict the future, but if we lose the liberal center, right? What your sense is?
Well, I mean, I think that it would be a blow to the interreligious movement. I wouldn't necessarily say a fatal blow, but it would be a blow. There is this. I mentioned already the Catholic Orthodox Jewish dialogue, which is largely confined to institutional leaders trying to work together on as the issues, whether it's against abortion, whether it's against gay rights and gay marriage, against trying to get state aid for parochial schools and so on, but not much else. They don't really talk much about theology or anything. You have also this kind of love affair between many of the evangelicals and Israel and the Christian caucus and the Knesset and so on, and that is very heavily political. Many people on the Jewish side ignore some of the theological suppositions of the evangelicals regarding the future of Israel in the long term, because they feel it's, they need friends, as they would say, and these people are willing to be friends. But we will see. I mean, I think one thing that's happening on the kind of the liberal center is this movement towards an emphasis on the wider interreligious movement, which often means less emphasis on the particular dialogues, including the Christian-Jewish dialogue. And whether I think we have to be very careful about protecting the importance of the kind of specific dialogues, and because we'll lose some things in the process.
Thank you. It's been a great privilege.
Okay, it was mine. Thank you.